What I'm about to reveal about Charlie Kirk's assassination will completely change how you see the radicalization crisis. The majority of what you've been told was incomplete or worse, deliberately misleading. Tyler Robinson's digital footprint has surfaced, and it's not just messy, it's explosive. It's the kind of discovery that doesn't just shake politics, it raises fundamental questions about how online communities shape young people, how narratives get twisted, and why powerful groups are scrambling to cover the truth. Stick with me because what we uncover here is going to reframe the entire conversation. We're living through one of those moments that historians will point to as a turning point, not just because of what happened, but because of what we're learning about how it happened and how desperately some people want to hide that truth from you. Tyler Robinson, a name that's now synonymous with political violence, wasn't some random individual who snapped one day. He was a 22-year-old man from Utah whose descent into radicalization happened right in front of us, documented step by step across social media platforms, chat rooms, and digital communities that most of us didn't even know existed. The accusations surrounding Robinson are staggering. We're talking about a coordinated attack that investigators believe was planned, discussed, and potentially supported by a network of like-minded individuals operating in the shadows of the internet. This isn't just about one troubled person. It's about an entire ecosystem that nurtures and amplifies political hatred until it spills into real-world violence. What makes the story so explosive isn't just the violence itself, but the desperate attempts to control the narrative that follows. Democratic leadership, legacy media outlets, and even academic institutions have gone into full damage control mode. They're working overtime to reshape the story, to redirect blame, and to prevent you from understanding what really happened and why it matters so much. But here's the thing about truth in the digital age. It has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply people try to bury it. And what's surfacing about Tyler Robinson's online life is painting a picture that completely contradicts the narrative being pushed by mainstream sources. The question we need to ask ourselves is simple. Why are they so afraid of you knowing the real story? But who exactly was Robinson online, and why is his history so important? To understand that, we need to dive into a world that many of us might find foreign and frankly disturbing. It's a world where political ideology gets mixed with fantasy, where young people form intense relationships with people they've never met, and where extreme ideas get normalized through constant exposure. Robinson's digital trail reads like a roadmap of radicalization. Investigators have pieced together his online presence across multiple platforms, Discord servers where he spent hours in political discussions, furry websites featuring cartoon animal characters, and gaming communities where political rhetoric gets mixed with entertainment. To those of us who grew up in simpler times, this might sound absurd, but for young people today, these aren't just hobbies, they're entire social worlds. The investigators didn't just stumble upon this information. They methodically traced Robinson's usernames across different platforms, matched his writing style and interests, and uncovered a pattern of increasingly extreme political views. His Discord messages, think of Discord as a modern version of chat rooms, but much more sophisticated, revealed someone who had been discussing political violence for months before taking action. What's particularly chilling is how his online persona evolved over time. Messages obtained by federal investigators show Robinson joking about having a doppelganger who might get him in trouble, claiming to possess manifestos, and making references to weapons, all while participating in communities that reinforced and amplified his growing hatred toward conservative Americans and Christian values. The memes, the coded language, the inside jokes, they might seem meaningless to us, but to investigators they told a story. One particularly disturbing detail involves ammunition casings found at the scene that contained phrases popular in these online communities. It's as if Robinson was leaving digital breadcrumbs that led back to the very communities that shaped his worldview. But understanding Robinson's online behavior is only part of the puzzle. The more investigators dug, the more they realized this wasn't happening in isolation. The communities he frequented, the language he used, the targets he focused on, all of it suggested a level of coordination and shared ideology that goes far beyond one troubled individual. And it wasn't just about who he followed, it was about who influenced him. This is where the story gets even more concerning because it reveals how online radicalization often involves real-world relationships that amplify and reinforce extreme viewpoints. Enter Lance Twiggs, Robinson's boyfriend and roommate, whose own digital footprint tells a story of political activism and hostility toward conservative Americans. Twiggs, who identifies as transgender, maintained active social media accounts celebrating Democratic politicians and expressing increasingly violent rhetoric toward Republicans and Christians. What makes Twiggs's role so significant isn't just his political views, but the influence he apparently had on Robinson's transformation. Family members and friends who spoke with investigators painted a troubling picture of Robinson's gradual change after becoming involved with Twiggs. They described someone who went from being raised in a relatively mainstream Republican household to expressing what they called pure hatred toward conservative ideals and Christian values. The testimony from Robinson's own family is heartbreaking. They told investigators that they had to cut ties with him because of his increasing hostility. His own relatives said they were afraid he might hurt someone based on the things he would say during family gatherings. Think about that for a moment. His own family, people who loved him, became afraid of what he might do. What's particularly disturbing is how family members directly attributed Robinson's radicalization to Twiggs' influence. They described watching Robinson change from someone with typical political disagreements to someone filled with what they called evil and hatred. The transformation wasn't gradual. It was dramatic and alarming enough that his own family felt they had to protect themselves by cutting contact. This speaks to something larger that we need to understand about how radicalization works in the digital age. It's not just about consuming extreme content online. It's about forming intense personal relationships with people who reinforce and amplify those extreme views. When someone you love and trust starts expressing hatred toward entire groups of people, it validates and accelerates your own journey toward extremism. Investigators discovered that Twiggs had been actively posting provocative content and anti-conservative rhetoric across multiple platforms for years. But more importantly, people close to the situation described him as someone who hates conservatives and Christians and who had a pattern of expressing those views in increasingly violent terms. The influence of intimate relationships in radicalization is something we don't talk about enough. When political hatred becomes part of your daily conversations with someone you're close to, when it becomes part of how you bond and connect, it stops feeling like politics and starts feeling like truth. For Robinson, living with someone who constantly reinforced his growing hostility toward conservatives and Christians likely accelerated his journey from angry young man to potential terrorist. But what happens online rarely stays online. It bleeds into real life. And that's exactly what investigators believe happened with Tyler Robinson. The hate, the planning, the coordination, it all started in digital spaces, but it was always heading toward real-world violence. The FBI's investigation has uncovered a disturbing timeline that shows Robinson's online discussions gradually shifting from political rhetoric to actual planning. His Discord communications revealed discussions about weapons, hiding them, and using them. This wasn't someone who suddenly snapped. This was someone who methodically planned an attack while discussing it with others online. One of the most chilling details investigators uncovered was Robinson's discussion about the specific rifle used in the attack. Messages show him talking about hiding the weapon under foliage wrapped in a towel hours before the incident. This level of premeditation, combined with his online discussions about manifestos and political targets, paints a picture of calculated political terrorism rather than spontaneous violence. Utah's governor has confirmed, based on family testimonies and FBI briefings, that Robinson had been deeply influenced by leftist ideology. But it goes beyond just political beliefs. Investigators are now examining whether this attack was part of a larger network of coordinated political violence. The scope of the investigation has expanded dramatically as more evidence surfaces about Robinson's online connections. Federal investigators are actively looking into whether members of his online communities knew about the attack beforehand. If that turns out to be true, and evidence suggests it might, then we're not talking about one troubled individual, but about a network of people who helped plan and potentially coordinate political terrorism. This is where the story becomes truly alarming for all of us. The investigation is revealing that Robinson's online communities may have functioned as what investigators are calling breeding grounds for radicalization and coordination. These aren't just places where people go to vent political frustrations. They're sophisticated networks where extreme ideologies get reinforced and where discussions of political violence get normalized. The evidence suggests this attack wasn't spontaneous rage triggered by political disagreement. It was premeditated political violence, fueled by years of online radicalization and potentially coordinated with others who shared Robinson's extremist view. When investigators talk about dark internet culture and digital terror cells, they're describing something that should terrify every American who values peaceful democracy. And yet, instead of confronting these facts, the media tried something remarkable. Rather than examining the obvious connections between Robinson's online radicalization and his real-world violence, major news outlets and even academic institutions began spinning a completely different story. The media's response to Robinson's attack reveals something deeply troubling about how information gets manipulated in our modern world. Instead of reporting on his documented connections to leftist extremism, his relationship with political activists, and his gradual radicalization in anti-conservative online communities, mainstream outlets began pushing a narrative that defied all available evidence. Major newspapers and television networks went into overdrive, trying to portray Robinson as somehow aligned with conservative politics. Despite his documented hatred of Christians and conservatives, despite his relationship with anti-Republican activists, despite his participation in communities dedicated to opposing everything traditional America represents, media outlets began suggesting he was actually motivated by right-wing extremism. The desperation became so obvious that even respected academic institutions joined the effort. Harvard professors, people who should be committed to truth and evidence, began pushing theories that Robinson had killed his target because that person wasn't right-wing enough. This level of intellectual dishonesty would be laughable if it weren't so dangerous. For those of us who lived through different eras of media manipulation, this might feel familiar, but what's happening today is unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. We're not just talking about bias reporting or selective coverage. We're talking about the complete fabrication of alternative narratives designed to prevent you from understanding what really happened and why it matters.
The media's behavior in this case reveals their desperation. They understand that if the truth about Robinson's radicalization becomes widely known, it will fundamentally change how Americans think about political violence and extremism. It will force uncomfortable conversations about which ideologies are actually driving young people toward terrorism in modern America. This is why media literacy has never been more important, especially for those of us who remember when journalism meant something different. Today's media landscape requires us to be detectives, constantly questioning narratives, seeking multiple sources, and thinking critically about whose interests are served by different versions of the truth. When you see major news outlets desperately trying to reframe obvious evidence, when you see academics abandoning intellectual honesty to serve political narratives, when you see coordinated efforts to prevent certain facts from reaching the public, that's when you know you're dealing with something much larger than simple bias. You're dealing with systematic manipulation designed to control how you understand reality itself. The Robinson case has become a perfect example of this phenomenon. The facts are clear, the evidence is documented, and the timeline is established. Yet powerful institutions are working overtime to make sure you never fully understand what those facts mean or why they matter so much for America's future. The implications for those of us who care about truth and democracy are profound. When major institutions abandon their commitment to facts in service of political narratives, it signals something much deeper than partisan disagreement. It suggests that certain truths have become so threatening to established power structures that they must be suppressed at all costs. Because when the truth gets out, the stakes rise dramatically. And that's exactly what's happening as more Americans begin to understand the real story behind Robinson's radicalization and the networks that enabled it. The FBI's expanded investigation is uncovering connections that go far beyond one troubled young man and his immediate circle. Federal investigators are now examining whether Robinson's attack was coordinated with a broader network of political extremists operating across multiple states and online platforms. What they're finding should concern every American who values peaceful democracy. The investigation has revealed that Robinson's online communities weren't just places for political discussion. They were sophisticated networks where members shared information about targets, coordinated messaging, and potentially planned real-world action. The scope of these networks is staggering. We're talking about thousands of individuals connected through various online platforms, many of whom have been consuming and sharing increasingly violent rhetoric for years. Some of these networks have been documenting the personal information of conservative leaders, sharing their home addresses, and discussing potential ways to neutralize what they see as political threats. Federal investigators have discovered that Robinson's case fits a pattern they're seeing across the country. Young people being systematically radicalized through online communities that combine political extremism with other subcultures and interests. Gaming communities, social media groups, and even seemingly innocent hobby forums have become recruiting grounds for political violence. The coordination aspect is particularly troubling. Evidence suggests that members of these networks knew about Robinson's plans and may have even encouraged them. If proven true, this transforms what initially appeared to be one person's violent breakdown into something much more serious: coordinated domestic terrorism carried out by organized political extremists. For those of us who lived through other periods of political tension in America, this feels different. Previous generations of political extremists were often isolated, disorganized, and limited in their ability to coordinate with like-minded individuals. Today's extremists have tools and networks that allow them to find each other, reinforce their beliefs, and coordinate actions in ways that were never before possible. The investigation is revealing that these networks don't just exist online, they have real-world components. Members meet in person, share resources, and coordinate activities across state lines. What started as internet communities have evolved into actual terrorist cells capable of planning and executing political violence. And that's when the conversation shifts from politics to something far more serious. When investigators and government officials begin using specific legal terminology, it signals a fundamental change in how they view these threats and what tools they're prepared to use to address them. The Trump administration has made a crucial decision in how they're framing Robinson's attack and the networks that enabled it, rather than treating this as ordinary political violence or criminal behavior. They're explicitly calling it terrorism. This isn't just rhetoric. It's a legal and strategic choice that opens up entirely new possibilities for how the government can respond. When Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance appeared together to discuss the administration's response, their language was deliberately chosen and legally significant. They didn't talk about political disagreements or criminal justice. They talked about domestic terror movements and terrorist networks that need to be dismantled and destroyed. This legal framing matters enormously because it activates different government powers and authority. When something is classified as terrorism rather than ordinary crime, it allows federal agencies to use tools and resources that wouldn't otherwise be available. It enables investigations that cross state lines, surveillance of networks rather than just individuals, and coordination between multiple federal agencies. For those of us who remember previous eras of political conflict, this represents a significant escalation. The administration is essentially declaring that certain forms of political extremism have crossed the line from protected speech into actual terrorism that threatens the stability of American democracy itself. Miller's comments were particularly revealing when he talked about channeling righteous anger into systematic action to uproot and dismantle these terrorist networks. This isn't someone talking about traditional law enforcement or political opposition. This is someone describing a comprehensive campaign to destroy organized networks of domestic terrorists. The administration's approach appears to involve multiple strategies working simultaneously. They're treating this as both a law enforcement issue and a national security threat, which means bringing the full weight of federal resources to bear on identifying, disrupting, and dismantling these networks. And with that definition, an entire set of actions suddenly becomes possible. The terrorism designation allows the government to treat these networks the way they would treat any other terrorist organization, using tools and authorities that were developed specifically for national security threats. The administration has already begun implementing some of these strategies. They've started investigations into what they're calling major left-wing organizations that may have connections to or influence over the networks that radicalized individuals like Robinson. These investigations aren't limited to the immediate participants in violent action. They extend to the broader ecosystem of organizations and institutions that create and spread the ideology that motivates political violence. One of the most significant developments is the decision to cut federal funding from any academic institution that promotes or tolerates the kind of extremist ideology that led to Robinson's radicalization. This isn't just about political disagreement. It's about using the government's financial leverage to defund institutions that contribute to domestic terrorism. The administration is also preparing to arrest and prosecute individuals who have been openly calling for violence against American citizens. The legal framework they're using treats these individuals not just as criminals, but as seditionists and terrorists who pose a direct threat to American democracy. Perhaps most significantly, they're revoking visas and taking other immigration actions against foreign nationals who celebrated or supported Robinson's attack. This sends a clear message that political violence against Americans will have consequences that extend far beyond traditional criminal justice. The strategy appears to be built around two main approaches that have historically been effective in dismantling extremist movements: defunding their operations and imprisoning their leaders by cutting off the financial resources that sustain these networks while simultaneously arresting their most prominent advocates. The administration aims to collapse the infrastructure that enables political terrorism. This represents a fundamental shift in how America addresses domestic political extremism. Instead of treating it as a law enforcement problem to be managed, they're treating it as a national security threat to be eliminated. The tools being deployed are typically reserved for foreign terrorist organizations, but they're now being applied to domestic networks that threaten American citizens. For Americans who have been watching political violence escalate over recent years, this response represents something unprecedented. We're witnessing the first systematic attempt to dismantle domestic terrorist networks using the full range of federal authorities and resources. The long-term implications of this approach could reshape American politics for generations. If successful, it would effectively eliminate organized networks of political extremists who have been operating with impunity across multiple states and platforms. If unsuccessful, it could lead to further escalation and more sophisticated forms of domestic terrorism. Which leads us to the big picture. What does this mean for all of us watching history unfold? The Robinson case represents more than just one attack or even one network of extremists. It represents a fundamental moment of choice for American democracy. The investigation into Robinson's radicalization has revealed uncomfortable truths about how political hatred develops and spreads in modern America. It's shown us that the tools and platforms we use for communication and entertainment can be weaponized to create terrorists. It's demonstrated that young people can be systematically turned against their own families and communities through sophisticated online manipulation. But perhaps most importantly, it's shown us that these threats are not inevitable or unstoppable. The networks that radicalized Robinson operated in the shadows because they assumed they would never face serious consequences for their actions. The decision to treat them as terrorists rather than political opponents changes that calculus entirely. For those of us who have lived through multiple generations of American challenges, this moment feels uniquely significant. We've seen political tensions rise and fall. We've witnessed various forms of extremism emerge and fade, but we've rarely seen such a comprehensive response to domestic terrorism that explicitly targets the networks and institutions that create and sustain political violence. The Robinson case has become a catalyst for addressing problems that have been building for years: the online radicalization of young Americans, the coordination of political violence through digital networks, the institutional protection of extremist ideology. These issues have been growing more serious for years, but they've rarely been confronted directly and systematically. What makes this moment particularly important is that it represents a clear choice between two different visions of America's future. One vision accepts political violence as an inevitable part of modern democracy and focuses on managing rather than eliminating domestic terrorism. The other vision treats political violence as an existential threat to democracy itself and uses every available tool to eliminate the networks that perpetuate it. The response to Robinson's attack suggests that America has chosen the second path. Rather than accepting political terrorism as a permanent feature of American life, the current administration appears committed to dismantling the infrastructure that makes such attacks possible. This choice has profound implications for all Americans, but particularly for those of us who remember when political disagreements didn't lead to violence and when young people weren't systematically radicalized against their own communities. The success or failure of this approach will determine whether future generations grow up in a democracy where political differences can be resolved peacefully or in a society where terrorism becomes the norm. The Robinson case has also highlighted the importance of media literacy and critical thinking in our modern world. The desperate attempts to spin his story to hide his real motivations and to prevent Americans from understanding the networks that enabled his attack demonstrate why we must all become more sophisticated consumers of information. For seniors especially, this case offers important lessons about how to navigate a media landscape that often prioritizes political narratives over factual accuracy. The ability to identify bias, seek multiple sources, and think critically about the information we consume has never been more important for preserving democracy and protecting our community. The investigation into Robinson's networks also demonstrates the importance of understanding how online communities can influence real-world behavior. For those of us who didn't grow up with digital technology, it can be difficult to appreciate how powerful these online relationships and ideologies can become. But as Robinson's case shows, what happens online can have deadly consequences in the physical world. As we watch this story continue to unfold, we're witnessing a potential turning point in how America addresses domestic terror. The systematic approach being taken, defunding extremist institutions, arresting terrorist sympathizers, dismantling coordinated networks, represents the most comprehensive response to domestic political violence in generations. The success of this approach will depend partly on public support and understanding. Americans need to recognize that what happened to Robinson, his transformation from a young man raised in a mainstream family to a terrorist willing to commit political murder, can happen to other young people if we don't address the networks and institutions that make such transformations possible. This is why sharing accurate information about cases like Robinson's is so important. When Americans understand how domestic terrorism actually develops, how it's coordinated, and what can be done to prevent it, they're more likely to support the comprehensive measures necessary to protect our democracy. So here's my challenge to you. Don't just be a spectator. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this case marks the true breaking point in American politics? Have you noticed changes in how young people in your community think about political differences? What role do you think online communities play in shaping political attitudes today? Your perspective matters because you've lived through previous challenges to American democracy, and your experience gives you insights that younger generations might lack. Your voice in these discussions helps provide context and wisdom that can guide our response to these new forms of political extremism. And if you found this breakdown valuable, hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, this one is just getting started. The investigation into Robinson's networks is ongoing. The administration's response is still developing, and the implications for American democracy are still being determined. We're living through history, and understanding that history as it happens is crucial for protecting the America we want to leave for future generations.